Good evening. Again, welcome to the Light Industrial Commercial Zoning Text Amendment Informational Open House webinar hosted tonight by the City of Lacey. Give another few seconds for the last few people to trickle in here. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, welcome. My name is Ryan Andrews, and I am the Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Lacey in the Community and Economic Development Department. I also wanted to introduce David Toyer. David is a consultant on helping the applicant through the process for the proposed zoning text amendment. And David will be giving the bulk of the presentation and the information here tonight. So the format for the meeting tonight is, first, I will start off with a city staff presentation to give you a little bit more information about what a zoning text amendment is, what this specific request is related to changing some of the zoning text, and the process that the zoning text amendment will undergo in its review with both the city's planning commission and the city council. And then finally, help answer some questions at the end of the presentations. David Toyer, as I mentioned, David is with Toyer Strategic Consulting. David will be providing some information related to the applicant's request to change some of the city's zoning and some of the ins and outs of what the proposal is, as well as presenting some supplemental information related to their submittal in terms of some additional information related to traffic, aesthetics, and some other things that David will touch on here in a second. The last thing I wanted to mention was for your questions tonight, we will be utilizing the chat box function of the Zoom webinar that we're hosting here tonight. So if you do have questions along the way, feel free to type them into that chat box. We will answer those at the end of the presentations tonight. And if you did happen to miss something and you wanted to go back and rewatch it, or you know, you maybe missed the first part, or you're going to have to miss the end, feel free to go back, visit the city's YouTube channel for this recorded webinar. This webinar will be hosted on the city's YouTube page, where you'll be able to see it in its entirety. So with that, one additional item I would like to provide some additional information on is that this is an informal process here tonight. We're basically providing some additional information on an applicant's request to change some zoning, but this is not part of the overall formal process. The next step in that formal process will be a public hearing to be held by the city's planning commission coming up on November 3rd at 4:00 p.m. If you would like to receive notice of the planning commission's public hearing or have additional questions, feel free to send me an email. My email is there on the screen. So with that, we'll get into a little bit of additional information on what exactly a zoning text amendment is. What it is a requested change in permitted uses across an entire zoning district. So in terms of zoning creates districts that define permitted and prohibited uses. Zoning applies to private property and basically is a list of uses that say what you can and what you cannot do with your property. And part of that is being proposed for change in one specific zone in the city of Lacey, and that is our light industrial commercial zone. The property owner, which is also the applicant, is requesting a change of permitted uses or change of zoning on all properties across the city of Lacey with that zoning. Currently, the light industrial commercial zone allows for, or actually does not allow for, buildings exceeding 200,000 square feet. What the applicant is proposing is that buildings can exceed 200,000 square feet with certain specific development requirements in place. And David will touch on what these are here in a little bit. It's important to note that no project is proposed for this property at this time. It's a request for designated the permitted uses. Any project would go through the land development process and be subject to the requirements of the Lacey Municipal Code and the Public Works and Development Guidelines. A little bit about the light industrial commercial zone, kind of what it is, where it's at. We do actually have 2 or 3 light industrial commercial zones. One is located on Carpenter Road, south of Pacific Avenue, near the Transportation Center for North Thurston Public Schools. The other major light industrial commercial area is in Hawks Prairie, located along Marvin Road, specifically Marvin Road west of Marvin and north of Britton Parkway. And that's really where this zoning text amendment would apply, because really it's the only area of the city that has a parcel configuration and a size that could potentially accommodate a building larger than 200,000 square feet. So although this zoning text amendment applies across the entirety of the zone, really it only applies to this property because it's the largest and most readily capable of handling a building of buildings of this size. So under existing zoning, so this light industrial commercial zone, it basically allows what the name of the zone implies, which is a mixture of light industrial and commercial uses. Examples of this are warehousing, light manufacturing. Those are kind of on the lighter industrial side, but then also a mixture of retail, restaurants, and auto repair on the commercial side. And as I mentioned, buildings over 200,000 square feet are currently prohibited in this zone. Under the proposal, the underlying uses within the light industrial commercial zone are not proposed to change. So the applicant is not proposing to change any of those uses, the warehousing, the light manufacturing, retail, etc. But they are proposing to change the standards, which would allow for buildings over 200,000 square feet subject to requirements. A little bit about the process that the proposed amendment is required to undergo. It has, since it was submitted right around the 1st of this year, undergone a staff and agency review. It will also be going through, or it has also been going through, a review by the city's planning commission. And as I mentioned, the public hearing on this application is scheduled for November 3rd, and that will be the opportunity to take formal comment on this application. The Planning Commission is an appointed body that is appointed by the City Council to make recommendations on land use matters to the City Council. The Planning Commission will be making a recommendation on this to the City Council after their deliberations later this fall. The City Council is the ultimate decision maker when it comes to changing the zoning in the city. And the City Council's decision on whether or not to move forward with allowing buildings larger than 200,000 square feet is expected late 2020. Again, if you've got questions, feel free to use that Q&A box, and we will host a question and answer session after David's portion of his presentation here soon. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to David Toyer from Toyer Strategic Consulting to provide a little bit of additional information from the applicant's perspective. So David, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ryan, and what a great introduction to explain what type of a process we're going through here and what exactly we're trying to accomplish. I'm going to stop sharing my video and go to share screen. So as Ryan mentioned, I am the consultant for the applicant in this code amendment proposal, and that's HBBP LLC. The proposed amendment is to change the light industrial commercial zone to allow for buildings over 200,000 square feet and certain circumstances where some other standards can be met. And I will get into those here as we go through these slides. But first of all, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the applicant for this code amendment. I think it's important to point out that the principles of the applicant entity is owners of commercial property in the Thurston County and Lacey area for more than 3 decades. And their business philosophy is about long-term ownership of assets. And so they acquire properties, develop them, manage them, and hold them for the long term. They've been a very active partner with the city and the Economic Development Council of Thurston County, really working to retain and expand businesses. Included in that was the retention of Conduit and the attraction of Univera to Lacey. And this entity, the applicant, has more tenants than any of the other industrial developers that are within Lacey, and overall has more small industrial tenant spaces than any other single developer in Lacey. Really, one of the big keys for this is flexibility, and that flexibility is important to the applicant to maintain the ability to support its growing tenants as the tenants need progressively bigger spaces. That's really a key driver of this proposed code amendment, was to look at the spectrum of needs that various companies have throughout their life cycle as they get started and they grow and expand. And in some cases, as businesses change over time and may experience some contraction. So the existing conditions of the site are shown in this photograph. As Ryan said, this is west of Marvin Road and north of Britton Parkway. In total, the site is about 60 acres. It is all zoned LIC, and there are a number of existing structures at this location today. These include the 3 buildings, if you can see my cursor over here, as well as this conglomerate of buildings that serve a lot of small industrial manufacturing and wholesale and other type of users that fit within the permitted uses of the existing LIC zone. The current code, as Ryan stated, is limited to a maximum building size of 200,000 square feet. The existing site, not including one of the southeast corners of what the applicant owns, could itself yield 6 medium to large size industrial buildings. But in the process of providing a large number of industrial buildings to the maximum size allowed by code, it would result in the elimination of 10 smaller tenant industrial buildings, which would negatively impact economic development in Lacey and really Thurston County, as those businesses would be dislocated, and there really is a lack of inventory available in the area to accommodate those types of users' needs. Existing small industrial tenant buildings that are located there would be in the northeast corner of the site, are not currently connected to sewer. And one of the challenges here with this site in trying to maintain those existing industrial facilities to serve those specific kind of tenant needs for smaller spaces is that those buildings are located near one of the city's wellhead protection areas. This would be what a site plan would look like under the existing code. I want to reiterate what Ryan said earlier. The applicant has not submitted a proposal for development of this site. We have wanted to work through this process with the city of looking at amendments to the code in order to provide what we think is a much better overall project for the city, as well as a project that will serve a greater number of tenant needs. Looking at this proposal, if one were to develop it and maximize the site for industrial development, you can see that there would be 4 what I would call small to medium size industrial buildings across the top portion of this property, ranging in size from about 138,000 square feet to 142,000 square feet. And there would be 2 additional buildings here in the 175,000 square foot range. The existing 3 buildings that we saw on one of the previous slides would remain under a scenario like this. And again, this is just one scenario of what can be developed here under existing code. And then this area that I've highlighted with a blue boundary is an area that the applicant owns but would be separate from this consideration because it's a different zone. But it is important to point out that that zone is planned for commercial uses, and that would be the applicant's intent. The flexibility that's sought by the applicant is for properties over 40 acres in size would be allowed an exception to require submittal of a master site plan, and the project would then have to have some specific standards that apply in order to balance out the ability to have a much larger facility versus the current limitation. So the idea is to take a larger site where it may not have been envisioned at the time that this code was created, what kind of impact this 200,000 square foot limit could have. And my understanding is that, and Ryan can clarify, this was actually outside of the city limits when the current code was adopted. But you know, as pointed out here with the 200,000 square foot limit, a size of this site, it provides limited flexibility in what can be done here. And when a user is trying to maximize the site for planning purposes and infrastructure purposes, you really get a more chopped up design and a lack of flexibility to accommodate kind of the redevelopment that should occur at a site such as this. This proposal would allow flexibility for these sites over 40 acres in site where they agree to a master plan. They would get one larger building, and really that consolidates a lot of these other buildings that we show in the previous picture. By getting that one larger building, it allows a developer of a site like this to retain existing smaller tenant industrial buildings, as well as support the protection of the city's wellhead. What we envision is the opportunity through this flexibility to be able to bring sewer into this site to serve some of those existing smaller tenant buildings. This also helps promote a growing diversity of building sizes, and it can be used to retain a lot of expanding tenants. As the tenants of those smaller buildings may expand, their facility needs could change, and some of the larger structures envisioned potentially on this site could accommodate those needs. Also, by having one larger building on this site, it really provides Lacey with an additional opportunity to attract a large employer to that community, or if there's an employer that wants to go through a large expansion, that type of a facility would be available under this proposal. So what that looks like, or actually before I get to kind of an example of what that looks like, let's talk just a little bit about some aspect of this flexibility, if I can get my slide to stay. With this flexibility proposed, I think one of the biggest issues a lot of folks will have a concern with is what the impact of such change may have to traffic and traffic patterns. As part of our application, we submitted to the city analysis by Gibson Traffic Consultants comparing types of development proposed under existing code, under the code that we've proposed, and under a former master plan to see what the various different impacts were. I think it's important to point out, looking at this table, that the proposed code amendments results in fewer overall trips. There's a slightly higher percentage of truck trips, and there's a few more trips in the PM peak hour. But under current code, as you can see here, 4,775 total trips. 12% of those, or 571 trips, would be by truck, versus the proposed amended code would yield about 3,000 total trips, a little less than half of the trips under current code. And the truck trips, while they would be less than the number of truck trips that would be experienced under the existing code condition, the percentage relative to the total trips goes up slightly. In all, this actually reduces the traffic impact if this were developed out under the scenario as proposed with this amendment. So looking at the code flexibility, this is an example of what could be constructed at this location. This shows one larger facility, slightly under 500,000 square feet. That replaces about 3 of the medium-sized or smaller facilities. And then you see down here 2 buildings that replace about 350,000 square feet that was previously shown in the plans for that location. And then this also results in the retention opportunities for not only these 3 buildings, but for some or some combination of these existing tenant facilities here that are serving these smaller users of industrial space. The flexibility in the code, the types of standards that are required, is that the applicant would get the flexibility of a larger building size, but there would be requirements to provide additional measures to protect the city's wellhead. And that includes things like hooking these smaller facilities that are currently unsewered up to sewer. And it also includes some specific standards to address things like how do you go about the buffers and other types of landscaping features that may be around the perimeters of this site, which influence how it may be viewed from Marvin Road, as well as the residential community across the street there at Gateway. I think one of the important things to point out in the flexibility of a site plan like this, you have a building here in this particular scenario whose truck dock areas on either side of the building are north and south facing. There are some advantages to that from a noise perspective versus the smaller facilities, which have truck court areas that were facing the residential development to the immediate west. The requirement for a master site plan and development agreement that come along with the flexibility of this proposed code amendment really creates a situation for the developer and the city to enter into a contract. That is essentially what a development agreement is. And that allows them to better look at the overall cohesive nature of how this development would be planned out, taking into account things like adjacent uses, noise, and looking at how traffic would be dispersed throughout the site relative to the various city streets around the site. So that's a quick summary of the standards that would be proposed. And that is also a quick summary of a couple of ways in which you could look at the existing code conditions that would be produced with development versus an example of what could be developed under the more flexible proposed code amendment. I do want to state again that this area down here in the corner is not part of the LIC zone. We are showing about a 70,000 square foot building on there just for purposes of providing kind of a scale. But that site is in a separate commercial zone, and it's the intent of the owner at this time to develop that in the future for commercial uses. We think that the code amendment as proposed with the requirement for a master site plan and development agreement, along with some specific guidance for standards that look at things like landscaping, setbacks, noise, traffic, and so on. The combination of those things together really make this an optimal opportunity for both the applicant, which will be the developer of a site here in the future, and the city to work on a plan for this large tract, which is one of the last large remaining tracts in the city, that is positive for the community in a number of ways by providing new development in conjunction with retaining some existing needed facilities that serve a particular portion of the city's business populace. And then also, looking at how we kind of make this a good neighbor to the uses around it. So with that, I want to just close with a couple of kind of final comments or things to offer that people can think about. And that is, market conditions right now under the present recession and pandemic are really changing. There's a lot of global impacts to supply chains. There's a lot of changes in how manufacturing businesses are looking at their just-in-time delivery needs, how much inventory that they may carry at a given time. There's also substantial changes to the retail marketplace and the commercial sector. Habits are changing in how people shop for their various different goods and expect goods to be delivered. Even habits and kind of situations are changing on the restaurant front of the commercial sector. This is going to require a substantial amount of changes to how we plan sites in the future. There will be changes to how we look at things in the industrial sector, and there's going to be a substantial number of changes coming down the line in the future as it relates to the commercial retail space. Having a more flexible code that allows for these larger building sizes, but does not limit still the types of flexible uses in this zone that range from industrial to commercial. It really provides a great, great bookends for us to kind of bring in a diversity of development opportunities at this location that benefit the city in the long run. It's also important for industrial property owners and cities to really look at that diversity of their available property. And, as property owners and the cities look at that, they've got to find ways to accommodate not only the existing tenant needs as they grow or shrink, but have available inventory that's kind of on ready demand for new opportunities that come along. Having been a consultant to the public sector and specifically to economic development agencies in part of my practice, one of the things that we deal with as a frequent challenge is there's often a lack of vacant industrial space available kind of in the size and time frame at which opportunities are looking in a particular community. And so when you've got an opportunity to have inventory available to be able to market to those new projects to attract to an area, that's really valuable in addition to having your existing facilities. The proposed amendment grants a considerable amount of flexibility in the building footprint element of how we plan this site. But it doesn't lessen the standards that are required for development in the city. It's really geared around providing the opportunity to retain spaces for smaller tenants, which serve as a feeder system to move into larger spaces. It takes into consideration a need to retain buildings here for economic development purposes, but also recognize that those buildings need to be retrofitted in order to support wellhead protection, which is a really critical environmental issue for the city and its residents that rely on city water. And it's also an opportunity for us to have site flexibility to accommodate common industrial concerns. And as I mentioned earlier, those would be things like noise from truck docks that face residential areas. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it back over to Ryan to moderate any questions that those watching may have.
Thanks, David. I think, yeah, you really made it, I think, very clear how, you know, our city goals, we have several of them that I think are better met under the proposal than you know, under current allowed uses. You know, I think he specifically, you know, for us, it's looking at those existing small businesses that are off Marvin Road. I think that's north of Evelyn Lane, between, yeah, I think it's right around Evelyn Lane, that are, you know, those types of businesses. A lot of them have been there for some time, and that type of you know, building configuration just doesn't exist other places in Lacey. And so, you know, if we were looking at a development proposal that you know, was maybe to remove those buildings in favor of a multi-building 200,000 square foot complex, there isn't the space in Lacey to accommodate them elsewhere. We'd have to look at relocating them, potentially even out of Thurston County. And so it's really important to get good local small businesses, and that's one positive for us. The other, as you mentioned, is connecting those same buildings to sewer. Those are some of the oldest buildings that are on the site, and they're currently on septic, which is a concern for the city, especially in proximity to our city well that's on the eastern side of Marvin Road, north of about 29th Avenue there. And then finally, we want to make sure that we address additional good neighbor concerns, like you mentioned, related to traffic and aesthetics, which you know, I would say that you've done a good job of addressing. With that, I do want to, can you stop sharing your screen, and I will put up another slide. Perfect. I'll just do this. So again, I wanted to remind folks that are watching live today that if you do have questions on the application, feel free to use that Q&A box and type in those questions, comments, or concerns, and we'll be happy to address them here in the next little bit. If you do have more questions, maybe more questions than what we're able to answer here tonight, or would like additional information on the request itself, what that specific zoning text language is that's proposed for amendment, and or any of those additional studies that the applicant has provided, please feel free to email me. There's my email address on the screen. I'd be happy to provide those to you. And again, a reminder, the formal public comment, the formal ability to be able to provide comment is at the public hearing scheduled for November 3rd at 4:00 p.m. So with that, let's take a look here and see if we do have any additional questions. I don't see that we
Ryan,
have anything. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to also offer up for those that are in attendance tonight or those that may be watching this after the fact. We do have some additional information that talks more specifically about some of the flexibility of the code as well as the standards that can be found on our company's website. And that's toyerstrategic.com/Lacey. And you will see those folks that may visit, there are a number of pages that kind of dive into some of the examples and some of the ways that we've put information together for the city. So I would say that it's kind of the Cliff Notes version of what we've provided you at the city, Ryan, with our overall application. And so for those folks that may not want to go through the entire packet, that would be a way for them to grab additional details. And then I also didn't mention it during my presentation, and you kind of touched on it. One of the challenges too with displacing the smaller types of industrial spaces is that with the lack of inventory of those types and sizes of facilities, not only does it have the potential to push them out of Lacey or out of Thurston County, one of the things that it has the potential to do is push them into rural areas, into larger kind of, barn type facilities or large shop type facilities on rural properties. And that really isn't a great end result either, as it would be less consistent with the Growth Management Act. And so whenever we can look at flexibility with inside the urban growth boundary to be able to have a diversity of, in essence, product types to serve a variety of customer needs, that, provides a better way for the city to kind of balance growth with also maintaining, an existing supply of space for existing businesses.
So I'm just looking at here. I don't see any questions, David. One that I might ask that seems to be somewhat common, it does come up every once in a while. Is there a tenant in mind that is committed to the larger building should this move through, or is this something that is more related to providing additional space and allowing maybe somebody to come in that's in the market for a larger building in the future?
There is not an existing tenant identified for the larger building. It's probably important for me to point out that we have picked the number of 500,000 square feet as a top end because I think it was really important to provide a kind of maximum building footprint, even though there's this trade-off where you can go above 200 with some flexibility provided you do certain things. I still think that, we felt it was important that there be a top limit to that. The 500,000 number was picked because, as you could see from the one site plan example, that's about the maximum largest building that could fit on that site while still maintaining those existing industrial tenant facilities. And there's no certainty that a 500,000 square foot building would ultimately be what is proposed. That is the maximum that would be allowed under this code, but it could wind up being something less than that. And maybe it's a slightly smaller smaller large facility that's greater than 200,000 square feet, but would be complemented by something else. It really is going to be market driven, and that market's changing pretty rapidly right now. But in general, the code amendment provides greater flexibility to the owner of this site, which is the developer of this site, to be able to respond to market needs, which puts Lacey in a more competitive economic development position.
Great, thanks. I don't see any questions coming through, so maybe I'll ask this one, and it'll be our last question, unless I get anything else, which is, Do you want to talk a little bit about traffic? And I think it's interesting in the traffic report that you submitted that the dynamic in how a larger building, the truck traffic that's associated with a larger building is different than the truck traffic that is associated with multiple smaller buildings. Do you want to touch on that a little bit? Because I know, from folks that will watch this in the future, there will be concerns regarding traffic. You showed that truck traffic overall will reduce, but do you want to touch a little bit about some of the change in dynamics as far as the types of trucks that will be utilizing the site?
Sure. I think one of the things I'd like to do, if I could share screen again real quick, is go back to the couple of examples here. Under this existing code, as you could see here, we've laid this out, and that gives a space kind of tally, a total of square footage. And then we've got, the total square footage here. So when you look at it, one of the reasons for the difference is you've got 963,000 square feet of new light industrial space that would go into a site under that first example, that existing code example that we showed you. Under the desired change, you're looking at, we ran a traffic study showing high cube warehouse for the large building, light industrial type uses for the smaller, 250,000 square foot, those two smaller new buildings. And then we looked at, what was the existing uses at that location. And really, the biggest difference in the reduction of trips is overall the fact that there's substantially more new development that occurs under the current code than under the desired change. So, the square footages are different, which drives, how much square footage you have drives how much product you have and how many employees you need. The other kind of change is the note that, these larger facilities can oftentimes, attract, warehouse type development. And so, we looked at a scenario where that was the case to try to understand, the dynamics of total trips and truck trips. And that's what's reflected here, in Gibson Traffic in their report. When you look at truck types, some of the smaller 100,000 square foot buildings, they may or may not have a lot of large trucks, but they can also have a substantially larger number of vans that are in and out. It just depends on how those facilities are used. If they're multi-tenanted facilities with smaller users, that's going to produce one level of traffic pattern. If they're 150,000 square foot building, and they're kind of a last mile facility, you may see a substantial amount of vans that are in and out of that site throughout the day. In each one of those scenarios, not only do you get a different mix of traffic that is produced by a facility, you really get different distribution as far as when during the day does that traffic move. And then you throw in variables like shifts and so forth, as far as when employees are coming and going, which are kind of that element of the auto trips in this example. So at the end of the day, what we tried to do is look at the realistic case scenarios of the existing code and the desired change. We threw in the former master plan just for comparative purposes. It really isn't applicable in this case. But we wanted to kind of present some realistic analysis on the traffic side that would be consistent with how development could be under the two scenarios we've shown site plans for. But any individual development is going to have to look at a more detailed traffic, what we would call a project level transportation impact analysis, to better dive into the what type of a use is it, what kind of traffic does that generate, how does that distribute, and those sorts of factors. I'm not a traffic engineer. I will never pretend to be one, but you know, there are what they call international transportation engineers, have manuals that they put out, where they very specifically prescribe, traffic rates that different uses have. And so, based off of the size of a facility or the type of a facility, those ITE manuals is what they're called, end up providing a great amount of information that kind of governs how traffic is analyzed. And then, on a project level basis, there's work with the local transportation engineers of a city to understand, how that traffic may distribute throughout the community and what types of areas, the traffic should be analyzed for potential impacts. So there's a level we can look at this point relative to the flexibility of the code, but, it's an example as we talk about this where when you actually get to a project submittal, which we're not there yet, we're just working with you on a code level basis. But when you do get to a project level, there is a substantial amount of additional study and analysis that takes place. And that's why the city has kind of the level of detail you have in your codes and your regulations, and how you go about reviewing development applications.
Great, David. If you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll put up one last slide here. I don't see any additional questions. I am going to put up the last slide again with my contact information and information on the public hearing. Give me 1 second to share that. So again, I would like to thank you for joining us here tonight for this webinar on a zoning text amendment related to the light industrial commercial zone and building sizes within that zone. I'd like to thank David for providing the information on the application and being willing to be a part of this tonight. This was not something that was not required. It's voluntary. It's the ability for an applicant to provide a little bit of additional information on their application, and we're thankful for him to be able to provide that information here tonight. So again, if you'd like to, if you have any questions or would like any additional information, feel free to let me know. My email address is on the screen. And again, our public hearing on this will be with the city's planning commission coming up on November 3rd at 4:00 p.m. So again, David, thank you. Everybody have a great night, and thanks for joining us.